Have you ever caught yourself lost in a moment, wishing you could hold on to it forever, only to realize seconds later that it has already slipped through your fingers? Or perhaps you've been racing through life, chasing one goal after another, only to wake up one day and wonder, when was the last time I actually lived? It's a question that many of us, no matter where we are in life, are afraid to ask. The truth is, in today's world, we are more connected than ever before, but also more disconnected. We're glued to our devices, constantly scrolling, constantly planning, constantly running toward what we think we need. The present moment seems more like an illusion, slipping away in the rush of everything else. But what if this moment, the one you are in right now, is the only one that truly matters? We live in a world of distractions. With the constant hum of technology, the pressure to meet deadlines, and the endless stream of social media updates, it's easy to forget that there's something much more significant happening around us right here, right now. We are constantly looking ahead to the future, or dwelling on the past. But in doing so, we overlook the only moment that's real, the present. This isn't just a personal experience, it's a collective one. The philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti once said, "The ability to observe without evaluating is the highest form of intelligence." Yet, how often do we truly observe? How often do we simply be in the moment, without judgment, without distraction? We're so wrapped up in our thoughts, in the noise, that we fail to notice the beauty and depth of the present moment. Let me tell you a story, a simple one, but powerful. Picture a man named Michael. Michael was a successful entrepreneur, constantly chasing new projects, new opportunities, new achievements. His calendar was packed from dawn until dusk. Yet, despite all his success, something was missing. He was exhausted, disconnected, and often felt a deep sense of emptiness. One day, while walking down the street, Michael noticed a child playing in the park. The child was so absorbed in the moment, his laughter echoing through the air, as he chased after a butterfly, unaware of anything else. Michael couldn't remember the last time he'd felt that alive, that present. It hit him. His life had become a race, and the finish line was always moving further away. The future had become his focus, and the present, the only moment that truly existed, was lost in the pursuit of what was yet to come. This story isn't unique to Michael. It's a story many of us share. We are all trapped in a cycle of striving, pushing ourselves to succeed, to achieve, to get somewhere better. We forget that true fulfillment is not in the future, but in the now. Buddhism, in its simplicity and wisdom, has been teaching us this for centuries. The teachings of the Buddha invite us to step back, to observe, to see the present moment clearly. In fact, the Buddha famously said, "The trouble is, you think you have time, but do we really?" When we don't truly live in the moment, we disconnect from the richness of life. The scent of the morning air, the sound of birds singing outside, the warmth of a loved one's touch, all of these things become background noise in the symphony of our busy minds. And without even realizing it, we find ourselves chasing something that doesn't exist yet, or holding on to something that is already gone. This isn't just a philosophical thought. It's a crisis of living. We've lost touch with the present. We've become so consumed by the past and the future that we forget that life is happening right now. In this video, we'll explore how Buddhism offers a pathway back to the present. We'll dive deep into how the art of mindfulness, the simple practice of returning to the present moment, can help us reconnect with life and ultimately with ourselves. But before we go deeper, ask yourself this: when was the last time you truly lived in the moment? When was the last time you fully experienced the world around you without distraction or judgment? Stay with me, because the answer to that question might just change the way you live. Have you ever stopped to think about the nature of time itself? We often see time as a constant, something that ticks forward, second by second, minute by minute. But in Buddhism, time isn't something fixed, something that simply happens to us. It's a force in motion, always shifting, always changing, always unfolding. The Buddha, in his infinite wisdom, spoke deeply about Timino as a linear sequence of events, but as an ever-changing stream of moments. He taught us that everything in life is impermanentenika, in Pali. Everything changes, and nothing lasts forever. The past is gone, the future is yet to come, and the only thing we can truly rely on is the present moment. Think about it. How many times have you clung to the past, replayed old conversations, relived old regrets, or dreamed about what could have been? How many times have you worried about the future, about what might happen, what you should be doing, what you could be achieving? And in the process, how many moments have you lost? The Buddha's teaching on impermanence reminds us that all of this, the past, the future, and everything in between, was like a river flowing through our lives, always moving forward, never staying the same. Let me share a story, one that comes from the ancient teachings of the Buddha. It's about a young man named Kesa, who lived in a village at the edge of a great river. Kesa was always looking toward the future, dreaming of what he could become, what he could possess, what he could achieve. His life was a constant pursuit of something that was always just out of reach. One day, Kesa decided to visit a wise monk who lived deep in the forest. The monk was known for his deep wisdom and his ability to teach people how to find peace. Kesa sat down before the monk and began to ask questions, but the monk remained silent. After a long pause, the monk pointed to the river that flowed nearby. "Look at the river," he said. "It moves without stopping, constantly changing, always flowing forward. But it is never the same river twice. The water that passed by you just now is already gone. The river will continue to flow, and you can never return to the water that has already passed." Kesa thought about this for a moment. "But I can look forward to the river," he said. "I can plan to visit it again tomorrow." The monk smiled gently. "You can, but remember, the river will never be the same, and neither will you. Everything changes. That is the truth of life." The Buddha's teachings on impermanence go beyond just an observation about time. It is a profound reminder about life itself. We often become attached to things the way things are, the way things were, the way we think things should be. But in reality, everything is in constant flux. The person you were yesterday is not the person you are today. The world you woke up to this morning is not the same world you'll go to sleep in tonight. Even the thoughts in your mind are changing every moment. And yet, despite the undeniable truth of impermanence, we resist it. We cling to the past, hoping for things to stay the same. We fear the future, trying to control it and hold on to the illusion of security. But this resistance causes suffering. We experience dukkha, the Buddhist term for suffering, because we expect things to be permanent, even though they are not. The first noble truth of Buddhism states that life is inherently unsatisfactory because of our attachment to things that are fleeting. We believe that if we just hold on a little longer, if we just try a little harder, things will remain the same. But the truth is, everything changes. Nothing is permanent. Imagine you're holding a handful of sand. You close your fingers around it, trying to keep it from slipping away. The tighter you hold on, the faster it escapes. No matter how hard you try, it keeps flowing through your fingers. It's the same with life. The more we try to hold on to things, whether it's a job, a relationship, a moment, the more we suffer when it inevitably changes. One day, a wise elder told a young disciple, "Stop holding on to the sand. Let it flow freely. What is meant to stay will stay. What is meant to go will go." That's the way of life. The Buddhist wisdom on impermanence teaches us to let go of the need to control time, and instead, to embrace the flow of life. It's not about running from the changes or resisting them, but about accepting them as part of the natural order. And in that acceptance, we find freedom. So, what does this all mean for us? In our fast-paced, goal-driven world, it's easy to forget that time is fluid, that life is a river, constantly shifting. But if we can begin to accept the impermanence of everything around us, we can begin to live more fully in the present moment. When we stop fighting against change, we stop creating unnecessary suffering. When we accept that everything is impermanent and stop clinging to the past, and we stop fearing the future. Instead, we can rest in the present. The Buddha's teachings on time and impermanence are not about making us feel helpless or overwhelmed by the constant change around us. Instead, they invite us to embrace life as it is right here, right now. By recognizing that everything is fleeting, we are free to fully appreciate the present moment. And this, my friend, is where the true art of living begins. So, if the present moment is all we truly have, if now is where life actually unfolds, why do we spend so much of our time running from it? Why do we constantly drift into the past? Or worry about the future? Why is it so hard to simply be here, right now? The truth is, the present moment isn't always comfortable. It's raw, it's honest, it's unfiltered. It asks us to face what's real, not what's imagined. And for many of us, that's exactly what we fear the most. In the Buddhist tradition, the present moment is described not just as a place of peace, but also as a place of truth. And truth can be uncomfortable, because the present doesn't care about your stories, your plans, your distractions. It simply is. And so, we develop subtle habits, unconscious behaviors. We build walls between ourselves and the now. Let's look closely at these walls. The hidden enemies of now. Enemy 1. Regret and clinging to the past. Regret is a thief. It sneaks into our thoughts and whispers, "You should have done this differently. You missed your chance. You'll never get that moment back." And we believe it. We re-watch old mistakes like reruns on repeat, thinking that somehow, by obsessing over the past, we'll rewrite it. But we won't. The Buddha taught that clinging upadana, one of the roots of suffering, and clinging to the past is like holding on to ashes, hoping they will reignite the fire. The past is not the enemy. Clinging to it is. There's a tale in Zen Buddhism of a monk who carried a woman across a river, a woman he wasn't supposed to touch according to his monastic rules. Hours later, his younger companion was still fuming. "How could you do that?" he asked. "You broke the code." The elder monk replied, "I put her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" We do this too. We carry what's long gone. We replay scenes that can never be changed. But in doing so, we sacrifice the only moment that's alive. This one. Enemy 2. Fear and anxiety about the future. Then there's the other direction our mind loves to run. Forward. Anxiety is fear dressed as planning. We call it being responsible. But often, it's just worrying in disguise. Buddhism teaches us about dukkha, suffering that arises from craving and aversion. Fear is often the result of craving a future we can't guarantee, or resisting a future we think we can't bear. But the future hasn't arrived. It's a mental construction of film our mind plays, but one that hasn't started yet. And still, we rehearse every scene, every catastrophe, every failure. We try to prepare for every possible outcome. But at what cost? We miss what's real, what's here, what's now. The past is a ghost. The future is a fantasy. Only the present is real. So why do we resist it? Because the present moment also carries things we'd rather not face. Enemy 3. Discomfort in stillness. When we pause, when we finally stop running, we meet ourselves. And often, we don't like what we see. Silence reveals the inner noise. Stillness reveals the buried emotions. Presence exposes the pain we've covered with busyness. This is why many people feel anxious when they sit quietly, or when their phone battery dies, or when there's no distraction in sight. Suddenly, they're face to face with the truth they've been avoiding. But here's the paradox. The only way to heal is to face it. A woman once asked the Buddha, "Why do I feel so anxious when I meditate?" The Buddha replied, "Because for the first time, you are not escaping yourself." She sat in silence, Then he added, "It is better to see your monsters than to let them control you from the shadows." This is the gift of presence. It shows us what's real even when it's uncomfortable, so that healing can begin. Enemy 4. The illusion of control. Finally, we resist the present because we think we're in control. We believe that by constantly planning, analyzing, preparing, we can shape life exactly how we want it. But control is an illusion. One of the most difficult truths in Buddhism is this: we don't control life, we participate in it. You can plant seeds, you can water the soil, but you cannot force the flower to bloom. It blooms in its own time. The moment we accept this truth is the moment we make peace with now. Because now is not something to manage, it's something to experience. The enemies of now are not villains outside of us. They are habits within us. They are fear, regret, resistance, illusion. And yet, these enemies are also our teachers. Because the moment we recognize them, we begin to see through them. We start to understand what the Buddha meant when he said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." We've seen how the present moment slips away from us. Lost in regret, hijacked by fear, swallowed by distraction. So, how do we return? How do we stay present, not just once, but again and again? The Buddha gave us one key word: mindfulness, or sati in Pali, meaning not only awareness, but remembering to come back to now. Mindfulness isn't about emptying the mind. It's about filling your awareness with what's real right now. You don't need to control the moment. You just need to show up for it. Take a breath. Feel it enter. Feel it leave. That's mindfulness. Simple, but not easy. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha outlines 4 foundations of mindfulness, a roadmap to presence. 1. Body, awareness of breath, posture, movement. 2. Feelings, noticing pleasure, pain, or neutrality without clinging. 3. Mind, observing your state, cloudy or clear, scattered or calm. 4. Mental objects, watching thoughts, patterns, and hindrances arise and fade. Each layer deepens your ability to live in the now. Let's break it down simply. When you're brushing your teeth, just brush. When you're walking, feel your feet. When you're listening, really listen. Mindfulness turns the ordinary into the sacred. A Zen teacher once said, "When I eat, I eat. When I walk, I walk. When I sit, I sit." Sounds obvious, but most of us eat while scrolling, walk while planning, sit while worrying. So we miss life. Mindfulness brings us back gently, back to the breath, back to the body, back to now. It doesn't mean you stop thinking. It means you notice thinking and choose not to be ruled by it. You become the witness, not the storm. And here's the most beautiful part. You can practice anytime, anywhere. Mindfulness isn't for monks only. It's for parents, students, workers, artists, everyone. It's not about escaping life. It's about entering it fully awake. The Buddha didn't say, "Run from the world." He said, "Be fully present in it." Because when you are truly present, you stop reacting blindly. You start responding with wisdom. That's enough. That's presence. That's the doorway to freedom.
Let's be honest. We live in a world obsessed with holding on. Hold on to your success. Hold on to youth. Hold on to love, reputation, even pain. But the Buddha taught something radically different. He said, freedom doesn't come from holding on. It comes from letting go. Letting go doesn't mean not caring. It means not clinging, not gripping so tightly that we suffer when life inevitably changes. Because remember, everything changes. Everything fades. Just like clouds pass through the sky, everything we think we own, feel, or our will pass too. There's a story of a Zen master who cherished a beautiful porcelain teacup. Every morning, he used it mindfully, appreciating its shape, its design, its silence. One day, a student accidentally dropped the cupid, shattered. The others froze, waiting for the master's anger. Instead, he smiled and said, finally, it's gone. When asked later why he wasn't upset, he said, I saw the cup is already broken. That's why I could enjoy it so much while it lasted. This is not pessimism. It's clarity. And clarity brings peace. Buddha taught that suffering arises from tanha craving, thirsting, clinging. We crave what's pleasant. We resist what's painful. We grasp at what we fear to lose. And every time we cling, we suffer, not because life is cruel, but because we're demanding permanence in an impermanent world. Let's clear a common myth. Non-attachment doesn't mean being cold, distant, or uncaring. It means loving without control, experiencing without ownership. It means, I love you deeply, but I don't own you. This job matters, but it's not who I am. I feel this pain, but I am not defined by it. That's not detachment, it's liberation. Imagine walking through a beautiful garden, picking up a flower gently, admiring it, and then placing it back. That's non-attachment. Now, imagine gripping that flower tightly, refusing to let go even as it withers in your hand. That's attachment. Which one leads to peace? With each breath, we are already practicing letting go. We inhale, and we exhale. Try holding your breath forever. You can't. You're not meant to. Life itself teaches impermanence. And when we accept this, we stop fighting time. Sometimes, the hardest thing to let go of is who we think we are. I'm successful. I'm a failure. I'm not lovable. I'm always anxious. These labels are sticky, but they're just thoughts, stories, echoes. You are not your story. You are the awareness behind it. The more we cling to fixed identities, the more we suffer when life doesn't fit the role we wrote. But when we let go, we become open, free to grow, to evolve, to be. So how do we live this? Start small. Let go of needing the last word in an argument. Let go of replaying that moment from yesterday. Let go of needing to be perfect. You'll feel lighter, and soon you'll realize it wasn't the job, the relationship, or the situation that was weighing you down. It was your grip on it. Close your eyes. Picture something you're holding on to, worry, a grudge, a fear. Now imagine placing it in your hand and gently opening your palm. Let it float away like a leaf on a river. Feel the space that remains. That space is your freedom. Thich Nhat Hanh once wrote, "You must love in such a way that the person you love feels free." That is true for others, but also for yourself. Can you love your life enough to not control it? Can you love this moment enough to let it change? One final note. Letting go is not giving up. It's not weakness. It's the strength to surrender what you cannot control. It's the wisdom to know what to release and when. Like a bird releasing from the branch. You don't fall. You fly. So here we are. You've learned to notice the now. You've touched the peace of mindfulness. You've tasted the freedom of letting go. But the real question remains. Can you live this every day? Can you return to the now? Not just when meditating, but when your child is crying, when your inbox is full, when the world feels chaotic? That's where practice becomes real. Living fully in daily life doesn't mean escaping to a monastery. It means transforming your life as it is. Washing the dishes, answering emails, walking to work. These aren't distractions from the spiritual path. They are the path. As Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh said, "The miracle is not to walk on water. The miracle is to walk on earth." And you perform that miracle every time you return to the now. A young layperson once asked a monk, "Do I have to leave my job and family to find peace?" The monk smiled and handed him a small bell. "Each time you hear this ring in your mind," he said, "return to your breath." The man tied the bell to his belt, Every time he moved it even slightly, it rang. At first, it annoyed him, but slowly it brought him home to his body, to his breath, to this moment. And over time, the bell faded. Because his awareness became the bell. That is the essence of daily mindfulness. Letting life itself become the reminder. You don't need hours of meditation to transform your life. Just 10 seconds of full attention can shift your entire inner world. One breath before replying in anger. One pause before judging yourself. One smile to a stranger, fully present. This is where awareness becomes compassion, where mindfulness becomes love. Start small. Turn routines into rituals. When you wake up, don't reach for your phone. Reach for your breath. Say silently, "I am here." When you eat, chew slowly, taste fully. When you walk, feel the earth meeting your feet. You don't need to add more to your life. You just need to show up for what's already here. Every act becomes sacred when done in awareness. Let's be honest. Our phones are often the biggest thieves of the present moment. But the problem isn't the device. It's how we use it. Try this. Before unlocking your screen, take a single breath. Before scrolling, ask, "What am I really seeking?" Set moments each day to be fully offline and fully alive. Your attention is precious. Spend it on what matters. When you're present with another person, they feel seen, and you feel connected. Try this in conversation. Put down the phone. Listen not just to the words, but to the pauses. Don't plan your reply. Just be there. Presence heals more than advice ever could. And in your presence, others often return to their own. Now, let's be real. Not every moment is pleasant. Sometimes, the now brings pain, grief, failure, fear. But the practice remains the same. Stay, breathe, witness. Don't run, don't fix. Just be with what is. As Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron says, the moment you are willing to be fully present with your pain, you stop transmitting it to others. Presence doesn't avoid suffering. It transforms it. Here's the truth. You will get lost again. You'll rush, worry, daydream. But every time you notice you've drifted is a moment of awakening. Return gently, no shame. Each return to the present strengthens your inner stillness. This is not about perfection. It's about remembering again and again. The 3-breath pause. Any time of day, pause for 3 mindful breaths. Mindful transitions. Use natural breaks, like opening doors, standing up, to return. Evening reflection. At night, ask yourself, when was I most present today? Celebrate it. Your life is already the perfect training ground. You don't need a spiritual retreat to awaken. You need presence. While stirring your coffee, while holding your child's hand, while folding laundry. The sacred hides in plain sight. Don't wait for later to live. This moment is all there is, and it is more than enough. So, here we are. After everything we've explored, impermanence, mindfulness, letting go, presence, you might be wondering, what now? Where do I go from here? And the answer is quietly simple. You don't need to go anywhere. You are already here. This moment is the destination. This breath, this sound, this heartbeat, nothing more is needed. As the Buddha said, the past is already gone. The future is not yet here. There's only one moment for you to live this one. You are not preparing to live. You are living right now. Not after the next paycheck. Not when things finally calm down. Not once you're healed or successful. Now, this is the miracle. This might be the end of this video, but it's the beginning of something far more important. Your own practice. Your own journey into presence. No one else can walk it for you, but you don't have to walk it alone. Every conscious breath, Every time you choose stillness over speed, awareness over autopilot, you are living the teaching. You are remembering who you truly are. And that changes everything. Living in the now isn't loud. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't need applause. But it is revolutionary. Because in a world of distraction, to be truly present is a rare and radical act. And every time you choose presence, you create peace, not just in yourself, but in everyone you touch. You become the stillness in the storm, the calm in the chaos, the light in someone else's tunnel. Before we close, I want to leave you with this. Whatever you're facing, joy or sorrow, clarity or confusion, you have the capacity to meet it with presence. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to control anything. You just have to show up, awake, gentle, and true. And trust this truth. This moment is enough. Because you are enough. Drink your tea slowly and reverently, as if it is the axis on which the world turns, slowly, evenly, without rushing toward the future. Think not hard? May you live each moment this way. Not chasing, not resisting, just being, fully here, fully alive. If this message touched something in you, if even one moment helped you return to yourself, let us know in the comments. What spoke to you most deeply? What will you carry forward? And if you'd like to walk further on this path with us, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you'll never miss another mindful step. This is Zen Buddhism wisdom, and we're honored to walk this journey with you. From our heart to yours, thank you